The wisdom and experience of Robert Craddock on a Monday. Hello to you, Crash.
G'day, Gerard. It's everything's happening this week, isn't it? Footy, cricket, Vegas is coming up.
We're going to spend some time on Vegas week and get the feel from you shortly. Just a look back first at the T20s, if you would. So a thriller on Wednesday, and then Australia's bowling was just way too much for New Zealand in those last two games.
It was, and sometimes we take it for granted, and also our depth. Like in last night's game, rain-shortened game, when the batsmen were all set to go biff, bang, whack, Spencer Johnson, 2 overs, 1 for 10. Nathan Ellis, 2 overs, none for 11. I mean, sadly for me, only one of those two will go to the Caribbean for the World Cup in June. I think Ellis will probably get there, and he's a great story. Came through the hard way. Sydney fella had to go to Tassie, and we always tell the story about him. One stage selling door-to-door tickets for the Wildlife Association to raise money. And these are gorgeous stories, Gerard. It's lovely to see someone like that can just stick at it and get there. There's so many come through like that in India, whereas we've got our own story like that. So it's wonderful, but. As you say, the quality of bowling, something goes through New Zealand's head when they play Australia. That incredible statistic, which will be spotlighted this week, 1 win out of 31 tests against Australia, New Zealand. Their last 31 tests, 1 win. Think of that. I mean, you transfer it, Gerard, to a football scenario. Is there any club that has that record against any other club? I don't think so.
No. It's the Serena Williams-Maria Sharapova rivalry, which was not a rivalry, is Sharapova felt intimidated by Serena Williams, and that got shockingly lopsided. Do you think there's something in the big brother, little brother psyche that plays out?
Absolutely. And I had a long chat to Ken Rutherford, the former New Zealand captain who works in Brisbane now as the boss of the Albion Park Trots, where he's doing a great job. And he was saying, look, you almost need to be written off against Australia. He said it's almost when they're no chance, they become a chance. And it's similar to narrative to it used to be with Queensland, the state of origin, against New South Wales. They used to love being written off. But I remember on the last tour of Australia about 5 years ago, and you and I were doing Cricket 360 after stumps, and we talked up the Kiwis, and Rutherford said he was sitting at home watching that in New Zealand thinking, I know exactly what's going to happen here. Australia win 3-0 because we think we're a chance. Yep. And that happened. So, but in a 2-test series, it'll probably be a green deck in Wellington. You just feel like saying, are you blokes going to fire up at any point?
That's so the idea of the green deck, which will that's New Zealand's best chance notionally is to get after this refurbished top order, isn't it? And unsettle Australia with a swinging ball on the green top. But then you run the other side of it and give Australia's bowling attack that same green top, and good luck.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the conundrum for them. They do fancy their chances. I mean, Tim Southey, if he's going to keep bowling at 127 kilometres an hour as he enters his final seasons, well, he has to have assistance from the wicket. He really does. And then you've got a 37-year-old Neil Wagner who roughed up Steve Smith, remember, with persistent short balls on that tour 5 years ago. Now, he's still around. He may try that again, although one of the reasons why he opened the batting is to get away from that sort of tactic because bowlers pitch the ball up with a new ball. So I'm fascinated to see what happens Wagner v Smith, because when Smith was absolutely imperious and untouchable, Wagner stopped him, and he hasn't been quite the same since because other nations have copied that a bit. They bowled short to Smith, and Smith's place in the World Cup T20 is really hanging by a thread now after his failure yesterday, Gerard. I can't help thinking that, the way he plays the game sort of moved past that a little bit.
So at the start of the last World Cup campaign, Australia was ready to move past Smith. The team, it didn't look balanced without him. And then he had that little resurgence in the BBL, didn't he? Post a test summer a couple of years ago when he went back and opened. And it was an incredible couple of innings, which sort of relit the fire. But you just watched him And he knows he hasn't been in this position terribly often, has he? He's auditioning for a place, and in those 2 knocks on Friday and Sunday, he was trying everything. He was trying to be unconventional and imaginative and to roll out the circus shots, but it's just not him, is it?
No, he's a nerdler and he's a placement guy, and he's he's not the guy who's going to hit a ball from Hobart to Launceston, is he? And, the game's been hijacked by those sorts of players. I absolutely love having experienced players in a World Cup because we've said so often, and it came true again in the last World Cup Australia won, heavy-duty players win heavy-duty tournaments. So I'm contradicting my own theory here by tipping Smith to probably miss out. But here's the reasoning, Gerard. Like, the average age of that 2020 team, would it be 32? Like, Josh Inglis is under 30, but barely anyone else is. So you've got experience. Stoinis, Maxwell, Marsh, Warner in there as well, Travis Head. I mean, that is a rock-solid, experienced top order. So it doesn't so much need Smith's guiding hand. And since the year 2020, his strike rate in international T20s is 116. Well, Travis Head and these guys, they're floating up towards 160. So I just, it's Smith or Matt Short for me. When you do all the sums and you pull them different ways, you say, we'll take this bloke, that bloke, it comes down to one last spot, and it's Smith or Matt Short. And Short can open the bowling. He's a power hitter. He was very good yesterday. He is a future player as well. So, yeah, they may stick with Smith, but I reckon he's more out than in at the moment. Your thoughts, Gerard?
Yeah, I feel the same way. And they have prescribed, haven't they, that it's opening or there's nowhere. And I just can't see, unless there was injury to Warner or Head, and then I'm not sure that it's Smith who's the next one in. But you can pretty well forecast that team from this far. It's only June. That the tournament's played, and Warner and Head are clearly going to open, and Marsh is going to bat 3, and then you've got the power hitters thereafter. There's not many variables, I don't think, in that setup.
And the game's changed a bit, I think, Gerard. Like, there was a theory a few years ago where, it's nice to have that hustler in there, hustling around at a run a ball and just keeping the show ticking over. Now that sort of player is deemed as getting in the road. Because you want power, and you say, we will back ourselves here. We will just go hard and go home. And so, that's why I think he's probably more out than in. They do love him. They like having him around. And experience counts in the big games and all that. But as I said, you've sort of got experience. Pat Cummins will be one of the younger players in the team. He's the Test captain. So it's an interesting choice ahead.
Do you feel like Tim David is now bedded down as an international cricketer?
Yeah, I do. He's an interesting character, isn't he? And I think he's the player who a lot of young kids are going to emulate. I see it in the nets, Gerard, and players like Jake Fraser-McGurk. They're thinking big time, big hits, big centuries. You can go places quickly as a T20 cricketer. You can see the world. You can have this exotic life, which Tim David's got. I mean, I don't know how much. Tim's got a Cricket Australia contract. He's got $1 million contract with the IPL, so he'll be earning somewhere between $2 and $3 million a year, and he's never played a first-class game for Western Australia. He was overlooked in the system. He tried. He played a lot of second 11 cricket. He didn't just sort of storm off or sulk or anything like that, but he redeveloped himself with this power game. And Dan Cherney wrote a nice story the other day about how he's driving 330 metres on the golf course, and the boys say it's something to behold. That is 330 metres. That's up there with the longest drivers on the PGA Tour, and it's this freakish swing he's got. But it was that power game that brought Australia from nowhere in that first T20, wasn't it? And he doesn't panic. And the funny thing is, one of the guys noted it too, when it was over, there was no exotic celebration from Tim David. he shook a few hands and walked off as if to say, yeah, this is actually what I do, guys. I'm a finisher.
Yep.
You know, I hit hard. And, in everyone else's verdict, the target was out of reach, not in his, and he got it, and he just walked off as if to say, job done, next assignment, thanks,
Yeah.
Incredible.
So a couple of the questions around the T20. Are we expecting that Mitch Marsh captains that World Cup campaign?
Yeah, I think so.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. They had a look at him. They weren't totally convinced he was the man. They always had Cummins waiting there, but I think they like the cut of his jib. How could they drop him now? It's so close, and he was Australian under-19 captain, wasn't he, all those years ago? So it's a nice sort of completing of the journey in some ways. You wouldn't write him off to be a future Test captain of Australia. Who knows? But this is a big assignment for him. They always knew he had one great thing in his favour, Mitchell Marsh. Everyone likes him. As we've said so often, Gerard, he's Switzerland. He sits there in the middle order in the Test team, and the batsmen and the bowlers who always haven't got along for different reasons. Some do, some don't, whatever. But there's he and Travis Head, those two. It's just funny they're in between him in the middle order because they're literally in the middle of everything in the team. Everyone likes.
Yes.
No one takes offence at Mitchell Marsh. He's a really safe choice, and so I think he'll be. He'll be captain for sure.
Do you think Matthew Wade will be in the 15-man squad as the backup keeper and potentially the backup leader if something goes wrong?
Yeah, I tend to think that he'll sneak in there, and once again, experience matters. I do. Do you know what? I've got to say, I still feel sorry for Alex Carey in white ball cricket.
Yep.
He didn't do a lot wrong, really, and he's still keeping well, particularly in the 50-over game. But I think Wade will probably go, and Inglis as well. And, Wade's, I just, as a gloveman, he's certainly, not one of Australia's greatest glovemen, but he's a good pressure player, and he can get Australia home when it matters. In previous World Cups, he's done that, and he might just have this one last yelp in him.
For the Test series, so we pick up where we left off in the Gabba. So there's a few things that come back into sharp focus, and that's particularly Australia's top 5. Is that the big question that sits over the Test series?
Yeah, it is. And you have sort of sneaky form slumps. Like, I quite enjoyed Dan Cherney's story on Manus Labuschagne's Test averaging dropping by 10. Over the last couple of years. He's just not playing that well, Manus, at the moment. And, Gerard, isn't it funny how luck always equals out in the end, doesn't it?
Yes.
Remember those stories from 3 years ago? Manus Labuschagne is the luckiest player in Test cricket. He's been dropped this number of chances, which is 5 more than any other player in the game over the same period. And all these stories about how he was lucky, couldn't do anything wrong, and suddenly all the edges are finding second slip and first slip, and it's just... And that factor alone, I'm telling you, that is largely responsible for a lot of the dip in his average by 10 runs. But I also feel that because he's such a cricket junkie, and it's on his mind 24 hours a day, relentless tinkerer, perfectionist, and those guys carry a lot with them. They're never happy because batting is a craft of a million theories, and you could always find one rattling around in the back of your head when you're out of form, I think. And so it carries a lot with him, Manus, forever tinkering and that, and not batting atrociously, and that's one of the reasons why he hasn't been spotlighted. But yeah, he's been out of form for sure.
The right decision was made with Cam Green to keep him in Australia for an extra Shield round, and he made a century to pay that off. So to keep him out of the white ball setup, to let him play that extra Shield game, to see if he could really bed down before he goes to New Zealand for this tricky assignment. So full marks there is the prioritisation of a Test series over the white ball stuff. At least gives him a better chance maybe than the form he was in.
Oh, yeah. And he's just one of those players, whenever he plays in Shield cricket, he just looks a class above them, Gerard. Yeah. He comes in, he's never ruffled, he's never flustered, he never looks like getting out. He plays with such serenity, and you just sense that he will get there as a Test cricketer. It's taking longer than they thought, I must say. But his averages are okay in Tests. It's just that as we said so often, all-rounders, whether it's Richie Beno, whether it's Andrew Simons, whether it's Shane Watson, they invariably take time. Not everyone's Gary Sobers and just comes in and goes bang, or even Jack Callis took a little while at first-class level when he came in. But they generally, because they're working on both skills, it can take them a while. But, he's learning on the outer. He's learning at the moment.
Robert Craddock, have you done the tour of New Zealand often?
Yeah, I've done a few of them, Gerard. In fact, my favourite was always the first one because it was Shane Warne's first tour there, just before the Gadding Ball. And I remember seeing him at the airport and he said, I've had a terrific start to the tour. And I said, oh, what's happened? He said, I've left my passport at home. I stayed at Simone's place last night and it's on beside the bed there. And he said, so I'm no certain of even joining the tour. But and Warne just lit up New Zealand, Gerard, that tour. And I always remember I was ghosting a column for Sir Richard Hadley, the great seamer. And one day we sat down, he said, I've got the lead today. My lead today for the column is Dennis Lillee was my hero. I always said there's nothing that will ever compare in cricket to watching Dennis Lillee's run up. And I thought I would say that to the grave, but I found something better watching Shane Warne. He said, this young kid, he said, I just can't believe how good he is. He said, it's just compelling. And remember, this was just before he was discovered, sort of thing, on that by the Gadding Ball, which followed that tour. And Hadley was all over it. He just sort of said, it's the most compelling performance I've seen for many years. And he wasn't an emotional guy, Richard. He was very straight-laced. And it just stood out. And one other memory of where you're going, Gerard, at Wellington, I remember when they were shooting Lord of the Rings, Liv Tyler, a famous Hollywood actress, daughter of Steven Tyler from Aerosmith, she turned up at the Wellington ground. And because the ground's so small and intimate, the whole ground was just talking. Players on the field I remember the Australians trying to point her out. Is she in that stand? Is that? And it was just, it was if it was Taylor Swift. Yep, there you go. Yep. It had that effect. And the test match for an hour and a half didn't matter. It was fine Liv Tyler, a daughter of Steven Tyler.
Now, the last time we were there, this was the Brendon McCullum farewell, wasn't it? And so Australia dominated those two test matches, but McCullum made that preposterous 140-odd from 80 balls.
Yeah, in his last test.
Yes.
And just, it was him saying, right, this is the way I've always wanted to play. I found it out late in my career, but I just, free man now. I'm heading into retirement. And cop this Australia, and he just went off tap, didn't he? And he had that in him, McCullum. He was a very interesting player, and the baseball creed, which he's passed on to England, has produced some of the best Test cricket of this century. We may bag it, and we may go, Adam Gilchrist did that, and yes, he was a baseballer before baseball. But as far as a collective philosophy, he's left an incredible imprint on the game.
So let's move there to Ranchi, where day 4 is in prospect today. It was in England's favour when day 3 started. India was splendid. They bowled England out for 145. The spinners did their thing right from the start. Ashwin took 5 and Kuldeep took 4 and Jadeja 1. So they had all 10 between them. And it was one of those agonising days for England. They just needed 35 minutes where it wasn't happening and just to settle, and they couldn't get that. And they've left a target of 192 and India is none for 40. So India are on the cusp of winning the series, Crash.
Yeah, and gee, England have been good. I mean, they've taken a couple of kids as their spinners, Tom Hartley, Shahid Bashir, and who had no right to be competitive. This is how raw Bashir is, Gerard. In the first innings of this test, he took he picked up an LBW, and in his first-class career, that was his second LBW. Like, you think of that for an off-spinner. Like, if I'd have said to you, taking a guess, most people would have said, open it to callers, they'd say, I would have taken 30, 40 LBWs. Yep. It was his second. Like, 2 counties overlooked him before he found his way to Somerset. 2 counties said, no, you've got nothing, mate. And to his credit, Stokes saw him and thought, the kid has got something, and he's very good at building the self-esteem. But he bowled 32 overs unchanged in the first innings of this test. But to ask these two young spinners to perform a miracle again in the second innings is a stretch too far. At some stage, they do feel the pinch. They're so missing Jack Leach, the crusty old left armer who was no one's idea of an absolute master craftsman, but steady enough. And that's all you have to be sometimes in India. But this scoreline of this series will probably be 4-1 to India, but it totally undersells how good England have been at various stages. And I must contradict myself from last week too, Gerard. I went off about how a 5-test series is too long in India, and, there's a hint of that. But I've got to say this, 4 tests into this series, it just reinforces the majesty of longer test series. Changing plots, heroes leaving, villains having a bad day, then suddenly coming out. Ollie Pope, double century maker, then a pair.
Yeah.
All these rich narratives develop, and they, there's so many just great stories have come out of these 4 tests. They've just been compelling for Test cricket. It's been a really wonderful series in every way. I found it as enjoyable as any series I've watched for years.
Yeah, I feel that way as well. Is Joe Root actually went back to batting properly and made a 274 ball, 122 unbeaten in that first inning. So even just one of the think pieces that was being written is, does Bazball allow for reflection, for introspection between games? And the answer to that was yes. Root's devotion to it was seeing silly, unnecessary dismissals, which he always would have curbed in the past. And here he was making good between the third and the fourth test, and under immense pressure after that first session of play when they'd lost 5 wickets. It was a really interesting study that you only get in a lengthy test series.
Oh yeah, and you could see it on his face, Gerard, when he walked out to bat in that first innings. Like, he was as focused as I've seen him, and there was no signs of the sweep even. Never mind the reverse sweep or the reverse lap. He just wasn't even brave enough to sweep the ball. So it was just the master craftsman at his best. And yeah, it did actually only serve to spotlight how reckless he'd been in the previous test when they really needed him, and he played that silly reverse scoop. But he's still quite something. Bairstow's been a real disappointment this series. I think his highest score is 38. Played a horrible shot to get out just after the break yesterday when he just bunted it to mid-off. And they just couldn't afford a bad Bairstow this series. They just needed something from him, and he's been poor. And Root is fired up, but it's taken a while.
Back to the raging Turner in Ranchi. So there's been good variation in these pitches, but the ball that essentially went under Stokes' bat in the first session of the first day's play had the English commentariat ready to sort of scream blue murder, and it's had its different moments, but this has been the absolute archetypal spinner's pitch.
I've got to say, Gerard, I just love it. I mean, well, look at where we are now. One team needs 140 to win. The wicket's sort of breaking up, but it's not too bad. They've gone through stages. For some reason, late on every day at times, it's looked more challenging than at the start of the day. And yet balls have grubbed along the ground. Then it's played all right. They've overread it. But this, to me, I so hope this test pitch doesn't get marked down. They took a gamble, India. And I'll tell you why, because there's a feeling that if it's a good pitch, India's spinners with their supreme experience and skill set just stand out. But when it's a lottery and a big turning deck, it's a bit like fishing in an aquarium. I'm as much chance of hooking one as your champion angler, because there's fish everywhere. And that's what it's like on a spinning deck. You just sort of, every child can win a prize, and normally do.
Yeah.
And Bashir did get his 5 for the first innings. So they were brave by putting up a wicket which was very cracked before play. But, it was... when I always see these decks, Gerard, I always think of, you remember when Tony Gregg used to see a turning deck and he used to just go off tap at the pre-game, and that was like it. But cricket will never, these sort of decks will never kill cricket.
No.
Never.